Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's 10 o'clock, time to open this hearing session. For the benefit of those who've not been present earlier in the week, my name is David Beauly. I'm a reporter with the Scottish Government's Planning and Environmental Appeals Division, commonly known as DPEA. With me together today is my colleague Ms Leven, who's also a reporter. We've been appointed by Scottish ministers to hold a public inquiry into the proposed Beauly to Peterhead transmission line and to report to them our findings and our recommendation as to whether Section 37 consent and deemed planning permission should be granted. Today's session will focus on effects on Capercaillie. Before we start the meeting proper, I need to run through the usual housekeeping arrangements. You'll find fire exits either through the door you entered or the door at the very back of the room. The fire assembly point is in the field behind me. We're not expecting a fire alarm test, so if we hear the alarm, we should not ignore it. You'll also find the toilets in the same locations. Please ensure mobile phones and similar devices are switched to silent. We're recording and live streaming this meeting to our YouTube channel. We retain the recordings for the purposes of informing the public and for training. We try to avoid filming anyone who isn't speaking, but we cannot guarantee this. So we'll take your presence here today as your consent to being included within the recording and the live stream. We have all of today to devote to this session, although we do need to finish at 4 o'clock at the latest because someone's in the room at 5 and we need time to clear. I'm hoping we'll be done in plenty of time before then. We'll break for lunch at about 1 o'clock and we'll also have a couple of short breaks as and when we need them. I've got quite a few things I need to go through on the agenda, particularly the earlier items on the agenda, so don't worry if it seems like we're making very slow progress. Things will, I hope, speed up towards the end. Later items on the agenda I don't actually have quite so many questions about. For anyone who's speaking today, you operate the microphone by pressing the button when you want to speak, and again when you finish speaking, when it's live, you'll see the light at the end lights up. They're quite sensitive, you don't need to get too close, but if you do want to move the microphone, please do so by the base and not by the stalk as it breaks them. So we know who everyone is. I'll ask the parties who will be speaking today to introduce themselves, starting please with the applicant.
Good morning, sir. I'm Paul Reid, KC, Senior Counsel for the applicant. I hope, and I suspect others in this room hope, I won't be speaking very much, and I'll melt in the background. To my left is Peter Wright, who's the expert ornithologist, and to my right is Nick Brown from SSE Transition, who can speak to the alternatives. They are the joint authors of the hearing statement. It may be that others along this table contribute at some point. I'll maybe let them to introduce themselves as and when it's necessary to go to them, but I expect principally you hear from Mr. Wright and to a lesser extent Mr. Brown.
And for Nature Scott, please.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Jacqueline Cook. I'm the solicitor instructed in this matter by Nature Scott. To my left is Jennifer Heatley from Nature Scott. She is the Energy Casework Manager. And to my right is Dr. Dave Parrish, who is a terrestrial ornithologist, also with Nature Scott. And together, to my left and right, Ms. Heatley and Dr. Parrish were the joint authors of the hearing statement today.
Thank you, Ms. Cook. You might want the microphone slightly close to you. My ears aren't the best these days, but it might just be me. But thank you. Okay, so a quick word on the format for today's discussion. It'll be a roundtable discussion led by me. I've read all of the evidence and the hearing statement, so other than maybe reading out short extracts, I don't expect anyone to be reading very much from their evidence. I don't claim to have all the best questions, so as we've said before the session, I'm quite happy if parties want to ask questions through me of the opposing party. If they think there's something that needs to be asked that I haven't covered, that's absolutely fine. I do have quite a few questions for you, and I'll be referring to a number of documents. As you know, many of these contain sensitive information, so we haven't published them to our website, and we also haven't provided hyperlinks to them in the Foundation and supporting documents list. I'm hoping that won't make it too hard to find the documents as we go along, but we'll have to see how we do. Obviously, on the subject of confidentiality, if we can try to avoid identifying the names of individual woods where Capercaillie might be present, and instead use the site reference number. That would be preferred. I suspect if anyone fails on that, it's going to be me, but hopefully not. Ms. Cook, thank you for your response from Nature Scott to the point made by Mr. Wright about capercaillie carcasses, and surely they should have been discovered. I did manage to check with Mr. Reid last night that he had received that, and which he did, so I'm happy that we discussed that at the relevant point in the agenda. For Mr. Reid, I don't know if you know yet, but there was application for expenses against the applicant by Mr. Callum Kemp. I don't know if you've been told about that yet. You don't need to worry about it now, but just for your information.
No, that hadn't reached me. It'll have no doubt reached a mailbox somewhere, but not me. On the information last night, we had a brief discussion, sir, at the end of the community hearing session. Mr. Wright has had the opportunity to consider that overnight, and we'll try to address it. But I do want to formally reserve my position on that, given the objection was based on collision risk dated from November 2025, and having regard to the discussions that have taken place in this application in SLBB, we are more than a little surprised that it was only a week ago that this information was sought. And in any event, on the limited information we've got, it seems to vouch the proposition that there have been no collisions with existing infrastructure in the area we're concerned with. But we have only had overnight to consider it, so I am formally reserving my position in relation to it.
Okay, fine. Well, we'll see what that evidence tells us and how important it is when we get to that point in the agenda, but I take your point. Yeah, just on the expenses claim, you don't need to deal with that now, obviously, but when you eventually receive it, I was suspecting that would just be another matter to deal with in your closing submissions.
I'll confirm later today once I've seen it.
Thank you. Okay, so in terms of the documents you'll need to have open, obviously we'll need to have your hearing statements. We'll also be looking at the applicant's shadow appropriate assessment. That was a response, I think, to further written submission request matter 9, and the shadow AA itself, I think, was part 1 of 11 in that bundle. We'll also be looking at the applicant's shadow derogation case, which was also a response to matter 9, and I think that's part 1 of 6 in that bundle. We'll probably be looking at appendices to that document as well. We'll also need NScott 17, which was Nature Scott's response to the shadow appropriate assessment and the shadow derogation case. From time to time, there'll be other documents that I might want us to look at, but I think you're all pretty familiar with the evidence, so it might well be that we don't actually need to pull those documents up. I'll just quote them to you so you can see what I've been looking at and what I think I've learned from them. And on that point, I'm not an ecologist, so don't feel you can't tell me I've misinterpreted something. I won't be offended by that at all. I really want to be able to advise ministers with the best advice possible, so if you think I'm completely wrong, do tell me. That'd be very much appreciated. So the first item on the agenda is the applicant's approach. Although my first question is actually more about whether my interpretation of the evidence on population is reasonable or reasonably accurate. As I understand it, the latest national survey of capercaillie was from winter 21-22, so it's actually quite old by this point, but that is the most recent one. And I think the estimate of the national population was 532 birds. Does that sound right? Yeah. Okay. And the Darnaway Forest, Lethen Forest SPA was designated, I think, in 2005. And very approximately, in comparison with the latest national population survey and the population survey from around about 2005, is it broadly accurate to say population nationally has probably decreased by about 75%? I'll ask Nature Scott first. Is that about right? About a quarter?
Decrease, did you say?
A decrease in population from designation date of the SPA of about...
approximately, yes. Sorry, yes. Approximately, yeah.
Is that just in relation to the SPA population?
Well, in relation to the national population, I'm coming on to whether we can assume the SPA population has followed a similar downward trajectory, but national population, it's gone down from about 2,000 to about 530.
Yep.
And what we know about more local population, we can find in RSPB Scotland's LEC surveys, I think the most recent of which was this year. And again, I suppose Nature Scott first, are you content that that picture, the year-on-year picture of LEC data, suggests a similar declining population here with the national picture?
Yes, broadly speaking, yes. Yeah.
Okay. So, bearing in mind, I think the population the estimated population back in 2005 within the SPA at date of designation was 23. So we could be left with a population within the SPA in single figures potentially. Yeah. Okay.
I would, yeah, I think in the shadow appropriate assessment, we provided some context about what the population within the SPA might look like if you looked at the similar downward trajectory for the national population. But I think it's also important to look at what the most recent survey data tells us from RSPB Scotland and from the surveys that were undertaken by the applicant. So I wonder if it's just a good point now to look into that a little more detail. So I think we obviously wanted to try and get the best picture possible of what the population's doing. So we've requested data from RSPB Scotland for the last 6 years. It was 5 years, and then we were able to add the 2026 data from this year, which has been really helpful. And also to FLS to get, because they hold records for Capercaillie as well from some of the nearby woodlands. And in, I believe it's figure 2.4 of the shadow appropriate assessment, we plotted all of that out as a kind of an overview of what all of those records look like. And then we've broken that down as a time series to show that change over the last 6 years. So if you look at figure 2.4, if you have that in front of you.
Do you have a page number for that, just so I can get it quickly?
In terms of a reference, it will be 017.001 as the shadow appropriate assessment, and it might be a separate figure.
Sorry, what's the figure number? 2.4?
2.4.
I currently have a white piece of paper. It's taking a while to open. Apologies, my Acrobat reader has now decided to stop responding. That's great timing. Completely crashed. All right. Thank you. Yeah.
All right. Do you have that figure? Okay, great. So that provides an overview of where both the records are and where the LECs are within the SPA and also the woodlands around that. The figures following on from that, so 2.5 to 2.10, I think give a kind of year-by-year follow-up of that data. So if you look in, will be figure 2.6, which is from 2022, and that shows the distribution of birds the last time there was an active LEC within the SPA. So since 2022, there haven't been any active LECs within the SPA, and the population, or the number of records within the SPA decreases rapidly since after that time. But the number of records within Site B and Site D have increased. And that trend continues over the subsequent years. And so in the most recent results from RSP Scotland in figure 2.10, we can see there's no leks within the SPA, and a single sign of birds potentially being there, and all the rest of the records are clustered around sites B and sites D. The only active leks, so we've got where we have adult reproducing male birds, are at site D, and the total number of birds recorded by RSPB Scotland in the most recent year survey was 4 birds, so 2 males and 2 females, and those are the only positive records of capercaillie we have in the whole of Moray for this year. So the remaining confirmed population within Moray is 4 birds, and there is currently no confirmed population within the SPA.
Dr. Parrish, I assume you accept all of that as accurate, yes?
Thank you. Yes, the figures are reliable from RSPB. I would say that that doesn't necessarily mean that there are only 4 birds in the entirety in that area. We know there are very few, but let counts and sign surveys, that kind of thing, they're not the equivalent to a national survey. But I would agree with the applicant's assessment that the birds are in a vulnerable position in this location. There's very few of them left. Yeah.
I might just come back briefly on that point, because there are very few birds, but the way to estimate the population is there's uncertainty around that. But the way that Nature's got look at the populations within the SPAs is to look at the number of male birds at the leks, and then double that to give an estimated population for the SPA. So that's how the SPA population is derived. If you applied the same approach to the records that we have here from the lek counts within site D, you'd also get a population of 4 birds. So although there may be individual birds out there in the woodlands, in using the adopted approach, we would still get to a population of 4 birds. And I think the other important point, just to pick up on the population, is around whether the population is functional or not. So we need both male and female birds to breed. The only confirmed male leks, or where the male birds are at leks, where they will reproduce, is at site D. So even if there are individual birds, female birds elsewhere in the woods, if they're not coming to the leks, they're not reproducing and they're not not a functional population. So in terms of a reproductive population that we know about in Moray, it's really those birds.
Okay, later on we'll come to the potential there might be for males to make the journey into the SPA if there aren't some already, but we'll deal with that a little later. RSPB Scotland, as I understand it, in their response to the shadow appropriate assessment, confirmed their view that such a low level of surviving population means that any adverse effect from this proposal on capercaillie could have a population level impact, potentially leading to the extinction of capercaillie in Morayshire. What do you say to that?
They're right that the population is incredibly vulnerable, and that additional mortality could have an effect. I suppose, in fact, an important factor is the point I was making about that functional population. So where we've got male birds left within site D, if birds disperse away from that area, and it's much more likely to be young female birds that disperse away from that area, if birds disperse away and there aren't males in that woodland for them to mate with, they're effectively lost to that population. So it's perhaps a slightly pessimistic way of looking at it, but if birds do move from that area, they're effectively lost to the functional population. And it's a point that is made by other authors and the research that looks at this. And I think we quote a couple of references from Roy Dennis's recent book, and also I think from Cortland where they make the point that if birds move away from good breeding areas or away from breeding sites, they're effectively lost to the population, and that can reduce the population. So, you know, even if those birds were to collide or be predated or whatever happens to them, that wouldn't affect the breeding population.
Dr. Parrish, do you want to say anything on that?
I would agree, in essence, that there is a high degree of uncertainty here. We know that let counts underestimate the number of birds present. We don't have any direct evidence on the way the birds are moving around in this particular vicinity. So I think it's hard to be confident in whether we have a functional population or not. But I would absolutely agree with RSPB's statement that any additional losses could be catastrophic for the birds we've got left. There are very few. I think we all agree that there are very few left. And it was actually in the paper describing the latest national survey in 21-22, where the authors said, with regards to fence collisions, acknowledging that there's no current evidence that fence collisions are driving the decline of the population anymore. Historically, yes, but at the moment, other things are more important. But they said that any further collisions could be important and should be avoided, and they were recommending continuing removing and marking of fence, deer fences, and that's with regards to the national population. So at a local level, yes, I would agree with what RSPB said, that if we lose any birds to collisions, that would be in addition to other pressures on the population and could be detrimental.
Okay, I want to move on to the second point, which I spelled out. This is regarding what we know about capercaillie dispersal ranges, the genetic diversity or similarity between populations, and any other factors. I want to consider the potential for there being connectivity between the SPA population and other capercaillie populations, including those in Strathspey and also the closer populations elsewhere within the Moray and Nairn area. So my understanding is capercaillie, typically sedentary birds, relatively small home ranges within which they often move on foot, but obviously they do fly from time to time within their home range when they need to, including when disturbed. And there are also, from time to time, birds can undertake longer flights, particularly in the case of first-year female birds, who can disperse from their hatching areas to find new territories, sometimes for quite reasonable distances. So we know there's a Moray and Nairn metapopulation, of which Darnaway and Leithen Forest SPA is a part. There's also the larger Strathspey metapopulation within the national park, which I think is where the core population is thought still to reside. I want to discuss the likelihood of dispersal first between the Strathspey and the Moray and Nairn metapopulations, and then look at movement within the Moray and Nairn metapopulation area. So first, looking at the route that birds could potentially take and the likelihood of them taking it between the Strathspey woods and the nearest Moray and Nairn woods, so those are towards the southern end of the Moray and Nairn area. And then I'd like, after doing that, we'd then look at the possibility of there being possibly a direct dispersal route between the Strathspey woods and the SPA itself to see whether that's actually a realistic possibility. It might be helpful to look at SSEN document 48E, which is a Cairngorms National Park document. So that's a plan showing woodland, both established woodland and areas of kind of new woodland, but also it shows woodland where there have been records, not necessarily up-to-date records, but records since I think 2007 of capercaillie within the park. So it looks like there's quite a few locations towards the northern end of the national park where capercaillie have been recorded. We don't know necessarily how recently, but taking the nearest of those woodlands to the nearest of the, i.e. the southernmost of the woodlands within the Moray and Nairn population, I measured it. Yes, sorry.
Sorry. just wanting to check the document reference for the.
48E, I believe it is. I'll just double check that.
Does it have a document reference in the foundation document list?
I don't think it would be in there. It's just confidential.
Ah, yeah, sorry.
It's Kilovolt National Park 2015. Capercaillie Framework Phase 1 report.
I think it's 17006.
Thank you, that's helpful. There is on electronic page 13 of that a plan, annoyingly on its side, but do you have that yet?
Yes. Right. Yep. Thank you.
My point really was that there are some woodlands towards the northern edge of the park, of that Straths Bay population, where Capercaillie have, at least at some point since 2007, been recorded. And I was interested in the distance between those woodlands and the nearest of the woodlands that support or have supported the Murray and Nairn population, which you'll need to take my word for it, but I measured that at about 13.7 kilometres. And looking at the Ordnance Survey mapping and aerial photos, etc., the majority of the route that dispersing birds would take would be over open moorland between those two areas. I'm really interested in bearing in mind what we know about Capercaillie dispersal and records that there have been that suggest that there has been a degree of dispersal, certainly of female birds, between the two populations. What do we think is the likelihood of birds, both female and male birds, making that journey from the northernmost Straths Bay population areas into the southernmost Murray and Nairn? Moose, start, Dr. Parrish, first. Do you have any views on that, both female and male birds? What's the possibility or the likelihood of that happening?
I mean, it's theoretically possible. Certainly for females, we know that females can disperse that far. It's theoretically possible for males if there's enough habitat in between. We don't have as much data on dispersal movements of males because it's generally been the females that have been tagged more. But in theory, yes, they could easily make that sort of movement. We know from some of that radio tagging work that the birds will fly long distances in a single flight over what would appear to be inhospitable habitat, like open ground, as you described. How likely they are to do that is really difficult to predict. It depends on what other options there are to them, and what the conditions are at the time, et cetera, et cetera. So I would say, in theory, yes, there is a degree of, or there is a possibility of that movement, and we know that historically that has happened. As you referenced, the genetic material from the studies in the early 2000s showed that there was some connection between the two meta-populations. But that, the genetic data, even in 2004, it was out of date, effectively, because it takes a long time for novel genetic material in a meta-population to spread to the point where you detect it in survey work. So, that tells us something about the historical situation. Doesn't tell us much about what's happening now. But from what we know about the sorts of movements that birds are capable of, females certainly could make that movement, and males could, I would suggest, if there are stepping stone woods, that would facilitate that for them.
I don't know if you know the answer, but do you think there are? Given that if the studies are correct on the dispersal of male birds is around about a 5 kilometre limit, as far as we know, do you think it's realistic, bearing in mind the presence of stepping stone woodlands, to expect that any would actually make that journey north?
I think it's realistic if the situation allows for it. Yes, I don't see a reason why they wouldn't. If the woods are in the right places, and I mean, whether a bird decides to disperse or not is a really complex issue, and some say that You know, a bird is more likely to disperse if it's in a high-density population because there are fewer breeding opportunities in that area, so they move elsewhere to look for somewhere to breed. The converse can be true as well. It has been suggested that when there are very few birds around, it's sort of indicative of perhaps poor habitat or something like that, so birds start to look elsewhere to find somewhere better. So trying to predict the likelihood of a movement is a really difficult thing. And as I said earlier, we don't have a lot of data to go on specifically in this area in terms of radio tag birds and recent radio tag birds on a large enough scale. So it's a very difficult one to predict with any certainty, but in theory, as I say, I think it's a possibility. We didn't have any concerns about the connectivity of the SPA, the Speyside SPA birds with the proposed development.
I'm not trying to open up the possibility that there's any threat to the Speyside SPAs, just for the record, but I'm just interested in how realistic it is for the population of those southern woodlands within the Murray and Nairn woods to be bolstered by birds making that trip, and obviously then subsequently the possibility that those birds could then make the journey across the line and into the Darnowen Leithen Forest SPA. Did you want to say something, Mr. Wright, on that?
Yeah, I agree absolutely with all those points. It's theoretically possible that the birds could move. A couple of kind of maybe useful points to think about as well. The studies that have been done, as Dr. Parrish alluded to, have been done from Speyside or D-side, so they're not necessarily in this area. And in areas where we've certainly in Speyside, where there's more complete woodland cover, so that the birds may be more likely to move within those areas. On D-side, though, there was less woodland cover, and the birds still did travel relatively large distances. In terms of the male movements, yes, they would need stepping stone woodlands to go, if you look at the dispersal distance of about 5 kilometres. And although there are some patches of woodland up over the Davos moorland, some of those are fairly stunted. They're not great habitat. They wouldn't look like they would support a capercaillie for much, or any great length of time. And another consideration may be that the SPAs that are at the northern end of the Speyside area, so the Anagach Woods and Craigmore Woods, if you look at the populations within those woods, they're very low now again. So they're about sort of one male recorded in both those woodlands. So if birds are going to spread north from the real stronghold in Abernethy and around that area, there are woodlands which are relatively depopulated already before they move out of Speyside, if you like, so that it may be that the birds find suitable habitat there and don't spread any further north. So.
And the follow-up question, as I say, was the possibility that birds might make the journey from those northern woods within the national park directly up to the SPA. It's a further distance, it's about 15.5 kilometres. I'm assuming that similar points apply. It's possible, perhaps the increased distance means it's less likely than going via the southern woodlands. Is that, yeah, you're content with that? Yeah, okay, good. Just check I understand that. So turning back to the issue of movement within the woods that support the Murray and Nairn metapopulation, the distance as I measure it between the nearest edge of Site B and the nearest edge of the SPA is about 3.6 kilometres, so obviously much closer. We'll come on to discuss the nature of the intervening terrain in a minute, but just in terms of proximity, it's fair to say that even for male birds, there's a very real possibility that they could make that movement.
Thanks. Yeah, they could from that woodland. If you look at the location of the leks, and male territories are often based around the lek, they'll stay within that area, and they're about 7.5 kilometres to the SPA. So in terms of birds moving to there, that's, they could get there over a couple of generations potentially, but it's unlikely to go within a single movement. And I think the other important thing that we'll maybe come on to a bit later on, but maybe now, is just which birds would disperse. So the adult birds that we've got at the moment are very unlikely to move from those territories across into the SPA. So you're really looking at requiring successful breeding and successful recruitment of young birds into the population for that dispersal to happen. And given the population trajectory and the current reproductive rate of Capercaillie, that's not necessarily a given in the long term.
Yep, I don't fundamentally disagree with that. I think that, you know, we know that the young birds are far more likely to disperse the greater distances. And in terms of movement between woods within the Murray and Nairn, again, we don't have any hard data to call upon, but it's theoretically possible. More likely for younger birds than older birds, but that's really as far as we can say.
A couple of quick questions on other woods within the Murray and Nairn area. Site G, which is a fair distance out to the east, I think it's about 30 kilometres east of the nearest edge of the SPA. I think Nature Scott's content in respect of that wood, the likelihood of population interchange is unlikely with the SPA. Yeah, you're content with that. And the other point I thought about that is, as far as I'm aware, geographically, but that wood is and the SPA are both to the north of the line anyway, so had there been any potential for movement, it wouldn't be crossing the line. Do you agree with that? Yes, yeah. And there's the same factor, I think, in respect to Site H, although that's a lot closer. I think it's about 11 kilometres away. That and the SPA, again, they're both north of the line, so there'd be no reason for birds to be crossing the line. That's fine, good. So the final question in this section, which was just for my own, it took me a while, but I think the pennies finally dropped, was on the question of mitigation versus enhancement versus compensation. It was a quick point. I was struggling to understand why certain measures had been proposed as mitigation and certain measures hadn't. Finally, it dawned on me that, and correct me if my understanding is incorrect, but in order for something to be mitigation, it must be mitigating an effect of the proposal, so potential disturbance or potential collision. Other factors such as diversionary feeding of predators or things like that, given that what's proposed is unlikely to increase the risk of predation, you couldn't classify something like that as mitigation. That's why it's being proposed as something else. And I think your point, Mr. Wright, was certain matters that can't be regarded as mitigation. Nature Scott's position is they come in as compensation, if you like, after the conclusion that there would be harm to the integrity of the SPA, rather than being proposed as enhancement in order to avoid that conclusion of harm to the integrity. And I think you were contrasting that approach, you say, to what their conclusion was in respect of Rothers 3. Is that? Could you just explain that to me a bit more?
Yeah, it was just to looking at what approach has been applied to other developments within this area, and Rothers 3 seemed to be an example where a slightly different approach had been taken, where a number of measures which are proposed as enhancement there, but are very similar to some of the measures we've proposed in the compensation plan, such as fence removal, such as habitat enhancement to increase the productivity of the population. They were accepted as enhancement. So it was really just to check that, yeah, the same approach is being applied in this case. And there are, we're looking at mitigating impacts, but you're mitigating those impacts on the population. So, if you reduce other pressures on that population, if you reduce other collision risk factors on that population, you're not mitigating the impact on an individual bird which might collide with the line, but you are mitigating the impact on the population. So there's an argument that says you could apply there. I know we've worked on other projects with very different impacts, but where relieving a pressure on another site has been taken as mitigation as well. So,
okay, yeah, it's interesting how you define the effect of the. If the effect is defined very tightly as collision, or if the effect is defined more widely as population reduction, and then I understand how something might become enhancement, might become mitigation when it wouldn't otherwise have been regarded as mitigation. I understand your point. But Perish, do you accept that your view, Ms. Heatley, do you accept your view in respect to Rothes 3 was inconsistent with what you're now saying in respect to this proposal?
Yeah, no thanks. The Rothes 3, yes, it was myself that dealt with that case. So it's slightly different, but I do accept that there maybe is. I think in hindsight, looking at it, we may have got that slightly muddled. But one of the things with Rothes 3 was we were actually mostly concerned about displacement disturbance issues rather than collision risk. It actually came at a time when collision risk wasn't necessarily as high on the agenda as it is now. And so we were looking in response to measures that the applicant had proposed in terms of, trying to mitigate effects of displacement, and there was actually a LEC there, albeit potentially not a recent one. So this was what we were trying to do. So the applicant had produced a whole suite of mitigation and sort of measures through a habitat management plan, which I think was submitted as a document. So we were looking at that and responding to that in trying to see, and a lot of those measures were on site, but some of those measures were off site as well. So that's where the sort of, I agree that, and actually, again, with this case, it has been somewhat slightly challenging to look at, what, like yourself, with mitigation versus compensation. So I think, there is that sort of element of it. So, but yeah, so I'm not sure if that helps, but.
Would you, if you were, or would you accept certain of the matters that are currently labelled as compensation, if they were to have to be regarded as enhancement measures and you were confident they could be secured, etc., I'm assuming you haven't yet considered whether that might have altered your conclusions as to the likelihood of the integrity of the SPA being harmed. Had you concluded that they were in fact deliverable as enhancement, might you have concluded that integrity wouldn't be harmed?
Thank you. So our view is that the mitigation has to be related to the impact. So we're specifically concerned here with collision risk. So we've looked at a lot of measures. We've tried really hard to look at, to come up with whatever ideas we can think of additional mitigation that might help to get us to that stage of being able to conclude no adverse effect on site integrity. But we just haven't been able to get to that stage where we are confident enough that collision risk could be completely, avoided or eliminated, that risk. So, so therefore, it's our view that the legislation would have to go through a derogation case and compensate for that collision mortality risk. I think I think when we start introducing the enhancement, it's kind of unclear exactly. We can totally see how there would be potentially merit in some enhancement works, but in terms of mitigating the risks and then working through that into compensation. So it's it's a bit of a minefield.
Yeah, it's not easy, and it may be something for closing submissions, maybe as to what matters are capable of constituting enhancement rather than compensation, and whether enhancement plus mitigation negates the need for compensation. But I don't think we're going to get any further on that. It's an interesting question. So I do want to move on to actual collision effects and item 2 of the agenda. Some of this I think has been shortcut slightly by some concessions I think that the applicant has made in respect of the proportion of the 11.2 kilometre length of line that separates the SPA woodland from woodlands to the south. Originally there was a 7.1 kilometre area or section of line identified, but we'll come on to some concessions that the applicant has made in that respect in a second. But the first point, just for my own education, is whether we think the primary source of collision risk for Capercaillie is from collision with the towers, or from the conductors, or are they both of equal concern? I'll ask you first, Dr. Parrish.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And we, again, have nothing to base an answer upon. We are concerned about both. We've had a lot of discussions focused on towers because it's a more novel element. I think the importance of the towers in this is really something that we've only considered more generally relatively recently when it came to light through review papers that capercaillie will fly into turbine bases. You know, up to that point, we didn't really consider that they were at risk of collisions with turbines because everything else we do dealing with turbines, it's the blades that we focus on. But yes, it's been shown that they will fly into turbine bases under certain conditions, and that is what sort of started the thought process that in this case, the towers could be a problem. Yes, they're a different structure, but the fact that they're sort of a 3D lattice work structure, sort of a cross between a turbine base and a defence, if you want, in some respects, we can't exclude the possibility that they're going to fly into these structures. But that's not to say that we're not concerned about the cables. Like many birds, there is a risk that capercaillie, if they fly high enough, will hit the cables. We know that capercaillie, generally speaking, on a day-to-day basis, they fly a lot lower, which again is why we've sort of thought that towers could be an issue. But there is certainly a risk of them hitting the lines as well, the actual lines between towers. So, but I wouldn't like to say which was the bigger problem, you know.
That's right.
Thank you. Yeah, the risk of the towers is an interesting one. It's one that we've sort of struggled, and we've had lots of chats about it and where that risk sits. There are studies that have looked at collisions of capercaillie with wind turbines. Some of them indicate it's the towers. Some of them it's not really clear cut whether it's the tower or the turbine. The birds are typically found on the pads, which are close to the turbine bases, but most of these wind farms where capercaillie are hit are in woodland, so you're less likely to find the birds, even if they've hit the blades, you're less likely to find them in the woodland. So the ones that you find are the ones that are on the pads around the towers. In terms of the collision with lattice towers, and it being a kind of novel risk, it's not a novel structure that's in the environment. You know, we have an existing transmission line very close to this location already, and there are lots of transmission lines with lattice towers. There isn't any evidence that we've been able to find of collisions of capercaillie with the towers. And we know they collide with deer fences and structures within woodlands. I think I've included a couple of photos in the hearing statement to try and show, yes, they are both structures in the environment, but they're very different, even to a human eye. Capercaillie see things differently, but they're very different structures. And I think the lattice towers stand out much more in the environment than a deer fence would, for example. And looking at all of the work that's been produced at the moment on the risk of collisions with birds, there's a lot of work globally, and particularly at a European level, to look at this issue because, with renewable energy targets, there's a huge expansion of grid across Europe, and a lot of research and work is being done to look at the risk to different species groups and how to mitigate that. All of that literature focuses on the conductors, and there's almost nothing in there on the towers. So although there is a theoretical risk and there's a lack of evidence to show where that risk sits, direct evidence of collisions with towers, the focus seems to be very much on the conductors.
If I could just quickly come back on that. The evidence of capercaillie hitting turbine bases, I think, is more clear-cut. Certainly the literature doesn't. I mean, I'm referring primarily to the review paper that Copps et al. Produced in 2020, I think it was. And there was no uncertainty expressed in that. It was very definitely assigned to collisions with bases. Obviously, we're going on what the reviewers are reporting. We weren't obviously directly involved in any of that, but that is what those guys concluded. So I'm confident that they were hitting turbine bases and not the blades. It seems perfectly reasonable to me. And the issue of, the lattice towers standing out more than a fence, etc., and should be visible. I mean, I thought the photograph that was in the hearing statement was actually quite useful because it showed two towers. There were two towers in that picture. One in the background was far less distinct than the one in the foreground because the background to that further tower was cloud. So which illustrates very nicely that the conspicuousness of these things depends entirely on context and background, and whether a bird is going to fly into it is going to depend very much on the situation as well. So it's not you can't say that it looks much more obvious than a fence, therefore it's not going to be an issue. I mean, turbine towers are going to be very obvious under most situations, most backgrounds, but they still manage to fly into them occasionally. And again, a lot of the studies that have looked at collisions with power lines, they don't differentiate between towers and the lines. They don't explicitly. I mean, I would agree that the vast majority of the studies that have been done and the species that have been looked at are probably hitting the cables and not the towers. But there are different prospects to Capercaillie. Capercaillie are flying much lower down. Turbine base. The towers themselves at the base are very wide. They're about 10 meters across in this case, whereas at the top they're very narrow, so it's much less of an obstacle. And as I say, most of the studies don't differentiate between whether the carcasses that are finding on the ground underneath have hit the tower or the line. The only study I'm aware of that has actually mentioned that is the paper from Pallet et al. That was submitted here, where they do refer to the towers. They try to show where the carcasses they found on the ground were where they were distributed along the line, and they summarize it as being in the middle of the span and towards the edges of the span, basically towards the towers. And their conclusion is that in the results section or in the discussion section, I can't remember where the phrase is, but they're saying that the data suggests that the birds in this case, which are again not Capercaillie, these are birds flying much higher, are probably avoiding the towers most of the time. So they're not excluding the possibility of them hitting the tower. And that is the only paper that I'm aware of that actually mentions towers explicitly. Most of the studies just are sort of referring generically to overhead lines or power lines, that kind of thing. So I don't think we have any clear evidence to say that nobody else has ever found a bird that has collided with a lattice tower.
That's all very helpful. Going back to the extent of the line of the 11.2 kilometres that poses a collision risk, and I think, as I said, the applicant has accepted, following Nature Scott's visit to a location along the line, that yes, that regenerating habitat might in fact provide an additional section of line over which Capercaillie collision could be a risk. And I think you've also identified another area at the western end where you've also said, okay, it's unlikely, but we can see the possibility of that. So I think that still leaves an area at the eastern end, which appears to be a large open area where I don't think anyone's saying at that extreme end of the line, or are you, that there could be a collision risk?
We are suggesting that the full 11.2 kilometres could represent a collision risk. I think focusing on what the habitat is like isn't the complete picture in terms of what is determining a collision risk. The birds we know will move across, as I said earlier, potentially unhospitable habitat. You could argue that a risk of collision could be worse under those circumstances because they're more likely to fly across to get out, if they're exposed in a pasture or a bit of open moorland, they might be more inclined to fly than to walk. So you know, I mean, what the chances are, again, we don't know. But I think there is a risk of birds colliding with towers or cables in these areas, where at first sight you might think that the habitat isn't, you know, suitable for capercaillie.
Yeah, certainly the area that we looked at was the area through the woodland, and that was informed by us looking at the woods and where the capercaillie records are, but also with the consultation response from Nature Scott, where we're trying to define where there might be a collision risk, and the advice following discussion was this was around areas that should be marked to reduce collision risk, so obviously the areas where the collision risk is expected to happen, and that would be woodlands or sections of the line between woodlands where we had capercaillie records from the last 5 years. So that's, if you look at the section that we've marked up, that's really the area that we're looking at. So that area to the west was excluded because the route between the SPA and where the birds are currently is more to the east, and that open section towards the east, there aren't any woodlands nearby where you'd expect birds to preferentially fly across that open area. So that was the basis for selecting the area.
Thank you. I understand.
So I was just one other point I was going to make, which was around in terms of the section of line that is where there is a risk of collision. That's true. You know, birds could, in theory, cross these more open areas, but ultimately, and there is a theoretical risk there. But ultimately, when there are so few birds, that risk becomes very, very low, and not just in the open areas, but even in the woodlands, when we've got so few birds, there is a theoretical risk, but perhaps the risk of actually having a collision is, we think, very, very low.
And we'll come on to that in a minute. What I can, and it's helpful, is what I can get from your revised figures is we now have a figure for 7.1 and we have a figure for the whole extent. So ministers can kind of weigh up which of those they prefer, subject to the other disputes over the methodology, which we're going to come to in a second. So, literally in a second, but we're going to come to it now. The two following questions I think we can take together, which were the relevance of population density to predicted collision mortality, and a discussion that follows on from that, discussion of the applicants and Nature Scott's different estimates of potential collision mortality. The applicant's made some tweaks to its calculations to address points that Nature Scott made about the 2014 Norwegian study, and I'm grateful for the highlighted version of that study. I now understand where the figures, I seem to be unable to divide one number by another to get an answer, but I now understand where that all came from, and I thought it must be me because Nature Scott hadn't queried the source of the figures. It was just I was failing to see them. So we have data from Norway based on the two studies, 95 and 2014. The 95 paper, referring to earlier studies, a quote I took from that is, a relationship between the number of birds in an area and the probability that collisions will occur seems evident. And I think Nature Scott, you accept it, it's kind of logical that the more birds you have close to a line, the more likely there are to be collisions with the line.
Yes, it's a bit more complicated than that, if I may. It might be illustrative to think, first of all, about our guidance for wind farms, which the applicants have also referenced. Yes, when we're looking at wind farm applications, we have a model, a collision risk model, that allows us to make predictions about the likelihood of birds hitting turbines. And density, bird density, is one of the factors that goes into that model, but importantly, it is aerial density. It is the number of birds flying through a volume of air at a particular time. So it's the birds in the air. That's the crucial bit here. It's not the birds on the ground. You know, if we didn't need the number of birds in the air, we wouldn't ask people to do it, because we asked people to go and count the birds on the ground anyway through breeding bird surveys or wintering surveys. So if that was sufficient, then we wouldn't ask them to do the surveys for birds flying. Specifically with regards to Bevenger, I mean, yes, you know, there is a logic, and we've acknowledged that there is a logic to the argument that the more birds you have in an area, then the more that there are potentially available to collide. But it's a more complicated thing than that. It's you know, how likely the birds are to fly, especially for something like Capercaillie, as we said before, that they don't fly unless they really have to. And the Bevenger 95 reference, which was quoted, that it's important, actually, I think, to point out that both of those Norwegian papers weren't trying to predict what or describe what causes collisions, or what factors, you know, are related to the rate of collision. They were interested in trying to produce a figure for collisions that they could relate to hunting bags. So there was no attempt to relate density to collisions at all. And the quote that Bevenger says, where there is the density, that the effect of density is evident, he references two papers. Now, I can't access either of those papers, but from the abstracts that you can see, they're very different. They're referring to wintering birds and migratory birds. Again, it's birds in the air that he's talking about. I think, my interpretation of that is that they're birds in the air. It's not the birds that are resident in an area, because we know that birds migrating are in flight. So there, yes, it's the number that are flying across the line that are at risk. And similarly with wintering waterfowl, which is the other paper, we know that the number of birds that are congregating on a lake or something like that and moving between a roosting lake and a foraging site somewhere else, that's the crucial factor. It's the number that are moving backwards and forwards across a line that's important. The number of birds, you know, breeding in an area, or what we're referring to as the Capercaillie population, it's not as relevant to. I think there are other factors that are outweighing the effect of the number of birds on the ground. And when you look at both the Bevenger 95 paper and the Broseth and Bevenger paper, they both give estimates of density of kappa, and they both give estimates of collision rate. And in both cases, where you've got more birds, you've got lower collision rate. And overall, when you group those together, you get a. I mean, it's not a straight negative relationship, but there is a negative relationship. Now, I'm not for a second suggesting that that's a causal relationship, that you get, you know, high collisions because you've got low number of birds. I mean, that would be very hard to explain. But what might be happening is that there might be some other factor that is more influential, that is affecting both of those at the same time. So, for example, it could be something like the habitat or the topography. So it might be that the habitat is such in certain areas that the collision risk is high, but that habitat is also perhaps not so suitable for kappa to breed in or something like that. So if you did a census of the population, you'd find fewer birds, but those birds that did decide to fly would be at a higher risk of collision, if you see what I mean. So maybe something like that is happening, but the data from Norway don't support the idea that we must have figures based on the density of birds present. I mean, if you followed that through logically, then we've got very many fewer birds in Scotland. So the Norwegian data would say we should expect a much higher collision rate, which I'm not suggesting for a second. But that's if you follow the logic through as suggested in the Norwegian data, then that's what it would say. I think there are other factors, local factors, that are far more important in determining collision risk than density.
Thank you. One of the challenges with this, trying to assess the impact here, is that we don't have a collision risk model for overhead lines. So we haven't got a kind of agreed starting point. And so we're looking at what information is available, what data is out there, what studies have been done that can give us information to provide an estimate. And we thought it was important to provide an estimate, particularly when we're looking at an SBA, because we want to be able to quantify that impact to inform the assessment, but also to inform any potential compensation as well. So I think, although Dr. Parrish is right, there are other factors at play for any section of the line. You know, the way the birds are using that environment, you know, the seasonal weather will influence the collision on that section of line. But in any given area, the population density and the number of birds that are there and that are available to fly across the line, whatever the other factors there, will have a fundamental influence on the level of collision there. So, although I agree that the way that density is applied in the band model for wind farms is different, it is looking at the density in the air. The density data is the data that's available for both the Norway studies and for the Scottish populations that we're looking at, and provides us with a way to try and apply the rates of collision that have been recorded in Norway to the rates of collision that we might expect in Scotland. I agree that there's not a clear linear relationship from the data. However, the sample size that we have is very small. So if we exclude the data from the year 3 study that we used, because it's not a complete study, we're down to 4 data points. The Bevinger study, although we reference the 2 densities that he reports there, they're from different studies. They're not necessarily from, well, they're not from the areas that he's recorded collisions from. They were there in there for context, and that's why we didn't select the Bevinger estimates to base our estimate for this location on. We used the Bruseth and Bevinger data because there the densities are related to the actual section of the line they're looking at. So there's really only two data points where we've got density data and collision data for a given section of line, and it's very hard to, you can't really draw a relationship from that. So although I agree we don't know the exact relationship, I think the research is clear that the density, the number of birds that are in an area that are available to cross the line, has a fundamental role in trying to estimate the number of collisions you're going to get.
I understand. Sorry, Dr. Harris.
I was just going to say I slightly disagree with the summation there, that the density of birds flying is clearly related to collision risk. The density of birds in an area is not clearly related to the collision risk. I mean, it's perhaps a pedantic point, but it is a fundamental, important point here. Yes, there will be a relationship in most situations in terms of the number of birds in an area generally will have a bearing on collision rates, but I think it's, in this case in particular, it's a minor effect. Not that I'm suggesting there's a better way of doing it, but I'm merely saying that, as we've said throughout, there isn't a reliable way of making a useful prediction. We know there's a risk, we can't quantify it. It's maybe useful just reflecting that the people that drew up the collision risk models for the wind turbines attempted to do the same for overhead lines and abandoned it because it wasn't possible. Through collaboration, they decided it was too complicated. There was no straightforward way of producing reliable figures, even if you had the number of birds flying across a proposed corridor, which we don't have for Kappa-Cavy. So, it's extremely complex, and we've said throughout that there isn't a reliable way of producing figure. I mean, I understand why the applicant is trying to do it. I get that, and I sympathise, but we are nervous about putting a figure on it and trying to suggest that it's very low, so therefore we can ignore it. It's not going to have an effect.
Yeah, just to say, there is a lot of uncertainty, even with the band model and looking at collision for wind farms. There's a lot of uncertainty around that, and there is uncertainty with what we've proposed or the estimates we've come up with. But that applies to all collision risk models. The point I think you made about the crucial factor not necessarily being the density, but the number of birds that might move across the line. You know, I think that's a useful point to pick up, because if we look at the number of birds that are available here to go across the line, and what that might look like in the future, we've already established we have two females we know in the woods that are breeding. If you look at the reproductive rate of those birds, it's about half a bird per year. So we've got from the population we have, we've got maybe one bird a year that will survive and could potentially then disperse out of that population. If that's a male bird, it's very unlikely to disperse out of the population. It's more likely to stay in those woodlands. So if you look at the average reproductive rate and the average split between male and female birds, maybe one bird a year, or one bird every 2 years even, that would potentially try and disperse out of these woodlands where we know the birds are into the SPA. So, you know, even if there's uncertainty about the estimate that we've produced based on the density, if you're looking at really a single bird every 2 years that might disperse and therefore might cross the alignment, and then you look at what the avoidance rate of that might be, the chances of that bird actually hitting a line, it's a very low number.
I don't disagree with that. Again, I would say that we don't know with any great accuracy exactly what the number of birds are in the area, but one thing that we haven't sort of touched on yet is that we need to have a mind to the future here as well, because we are obliged to consider the recovery of the SPA as well as the current situation. And I would also reiterate the point that, you know, in the report on the latest national survey suggested that any single collision with a deer fence would be detrimental, and efforts should be made to avoid it. So we are, you know, we're coming at this from the view that we know there's a risk, we can't quantify it, but if we lose a bird, especially if it's an adult bird, then we think that's a serious problem for the SPA population.
No, I understand. I do want to come back to, I've got it later in the agenda, to come back to the question that I think RSPB Scotland raised about if the aspiration is to get back to the 23 birds in the SPA, shouldn't we be actually assuming a 4 times higher density or something of that? I will come back to that, definitely.
Just a point to say that the risk of collision obviously relates to the birds in the air, like Dr. Parrish has said. We are looking at mitigation measures to reduce that, to avoid birds being in the air. So even with that very low number of birds, the mitigation that we're proposing is to keep the birds on the ground and, you know, to avoid them flying. So that's also aimed at reducing those numbers of flights. Just one other point on the risk of a single bird colliding, and again the approach that's been applied on other projects. There are a number of wind farms that have been consented in the last few years within the same connectivity distance to the SPA, and the approach for those has been taken that there is a theoretical risk of birds crossing this wind farm and colliding with the wind farm, but that the likelihood of that happening, the number of birds that would apply to is very low, and then that with the avoidance rate, the chance of a collision is even lower, and therefore the projects haven't been objected to. And I think that same argument applies for this project, albeit that the reason for the low number of flights is not the location of the project or the habitats of the project, but it's just now that the population is so low that the number of birds that are available to collide is also so low, that same logic I think should apply to this project.
That was really very helpful. Yeah, it's very difficult issue to address, but I now understand fully where you're both coming from. So if we set aside the question of whether population density should be used or should not be used, I just wanted to check whether parties agreed on the figure of 0.26 birds per square kilometre, which I think was taken from the last national survey. So the note I have for Easter Ross, Murray and Nairn, the figure was 0.26 birds per square kilometre. Just as a, whether that's useful or not, you accept that that's factually correct. That's the best evidence we have. Yeah. And if anything, it's gone down presumably since that. Yeah, that's fine. So you're coming back to the point that I mentioned and you raised about RSPB Scotland's view that our aspiration, our duty even, should be to get the SPA back into a fit state where the population levels were significantly higher. Should we, in fact, be, if we are to take account of density, should we be, in fact, assuming a higher local density than the 0.26? I think that was the point you were wanting to make.
Yeah, I mean, we weren't sort of making that point specifically with coming up with another figure, another density figure, but we are mindful that, you know, our duty is to think about the recovery of the SPA population and what might prevent that from happening. And as we've said, we've got very few birds at the moment, and any additional losses will probably prevent recovery. And yeah, I mean, we acknowledge that there's lots of other pressures on the population already, and collisions with power lines are probably not the most important, but they're there. We know they're happening, and we want to try and minimise them as much as we can to give the population a chance of recovery. Yes, there probably needs to be other things done as well, because you know, a single factor isn't going to make a huge difference in this area. It's going to need a multifaceted approach, I think, but we don't want any more losses. I don't think the population can sustain any more losses.
Yeah, I'd agree that the aspiration for the SPA should be that population should be maintained and, if possible, restored to that 23 individuals. The conservation objective that we're dealing with is to maintain the population of the species as a viable component of the site. I would argue quite strongly that it's already not a viable component of the site because we don't have any males there. There's no population there already. So it is really looking at, will birds recolonise the SPA? The population trajectory is still continuing downwards, and I think as Nature Scott pointed out in their response, there have been conservation activities ongoing for a number of years, and they haven't made a difference. So when we're doing impact assessments, we obviously have to look at what the future baseline is. So what does the baseline look like without the project and in the future? And if the population trajectory continues, even without this project, the Maori population is very likely to go extinct in the very near future. So I think that's one of the kind of key things to look at. And another point worth noting, the SPAs are monitored and work is done to look at what the pressures are on those sites and to try and manage those. The monitoring at the moment lists the pressures on the site, and it lists disturbance, and it lists tree disease as the pressures. There's no mention of mortality or impacts from the existing overhead line on the SPA as being a threat to the SPA or something that's affecting the population.
Yep, that's true. We don't list it at the moment, but when it comes to site condition monitoring, you know, we don't do sort of extensive surveys and you know, little research projects to find out what's going on and what's driving the population. Because we have staff that visit the site and they make a very cursory inspection of what's going on and what the habitat looks like, that sort of thing. They wouldn't be looking, for example, at the number of predators in the area, or looking very far afield to look at external factors. So I don't think it means anything that the power lines haven't been listed. I do think it's something that's not been on our radar, to be perfectly honest. But yeah, it's not something that we would routinely look into and consider. We don't do an extensive sort of detailed dive into what's going on and what's behind the level of the population in any of our protected areas, or whatever site we're looking at.
If we can have a look at the table 2 in Mr. Wright's hearing statement, which is the revised estimates for capercaillie mortality. It's on electronic page 39, I think. I'm going to ask you a little later about the likely effectiveness of the mitigation measures that are proposed. I just wanted to make sure I understood the basis for the numbers correctly first. So we can see there are two figures for the mean estimated annual mortality based on either 7.1 kilometres or 11.2 kilometres, depending on which length of line we're looking at. Pre-mitigation, 0.413 for 7.1 kilometres and 0.652 for 11.2 kilometres. You then introduce the effect of sighting the line parallel to the existing 275 kV line, and you make a 67% reduction for that. I understand that. We'll talk about whether that's reasonable in a minute. The second reduction you then apply is for 64% reduction to account for mitigation. I'm assuming that covers both the painting of the towers and the Heathland creation. I ask that because obviously there is a study that 64 figure jumped out because that was a reference to the effect of marking of deer fences, but you're not counting that as 64% plus something else. Your 64% covers the marking of the towers and any other measures, the Heathland creation to encourage walking.
Yeah, the 64% reduction comes from the study showing that that's the effectiveness of marking deer fences, and we feel that is applicable for marking the towers as well. We think that's a reasonable assumption to make. We haven't put a number on the on how effective the heathland planting might be in terms of reducing collisions by encouraging the birds to walk under the line, but yeah, you could take that as being included. We haven't added anything else onto that number.
Is that because you doubt its effectiveness, or you just can't quantify it?
Because we can't quantify it. I'm confident that it would be effective, and certainly the responses from RSPB and NatureScot agree that it's likely to encourage birds to walk rather than fly, and therefore reduce the number of flights and reduce collision. But there are no studies. There's nothing that we've been able to find in the literature that says what that change in behaviour might be in terms of numbers. We do have this study that shows how effective marking of structures is, so we've applied that number.
I don't know if you want to say anything at this moment. We're going to come on to talk about the effectiveness, so I just wanted to make sure I understood the figures correctly. Okay. Shall we take a short 10-minute break? Come back at 11:35, just have a quick comfort break. Thank you. Okay, thank you. So I want to talk about 3 observations that the applicant made about the Norwegian data and Nature Scott's comments on those observations. Nature Scott in NScott 17 notes that the applicant observed that the 95 Norwegian study included collisions with lower voltage lines down to 22 kilovolts, where the conductors could have been lower and therefore perhaps might have presented a higher collision risk than would be the case with this proposal. I think Nature Scott, you say, well, we simply don't know what proportion of higher and lower voltage lines there are. It appears there's a lack of data on the highest voltage lines, so we simply can't really draw any conclusions from that. But I think it's right to say that the applicant hasn't used that observation to reduce their estimate in respect of Scotland. They've simply provided it as, I suppose, an example of them taking a conservative approach. You accept that? Yeah, fine. In respect of what I understand was the narrower wayleave corridor in the 2014 Norwegian study, I think it was 30 metres rather than 90 metres, or perhaps 70 metres in this case in broadleaf woodland. Do you accept that if that factor had any effect, it's likely probably to have resulted in a higher rate of collision in Norway than we would expect here?
Yes, I'm not sure where that figure came from. I couldn't see that in the Broseth and Bevenger paper.
Okay, unless I've imagined it, maybe Mr. Wright can help with.
There's a description of the line given and the corridor width. I couldn't see that in the paper.
Yeah, it's not in the paper, but it's the line, or the location of the line is easily identifiable on Google Earth, so you can look and see what the wayleave is of the actual section of the alignment.
And you can see the number of cables on it. And
Yes.
okay.
And yeah, there are photographs of or waypoints on the road that crosses under the alignment, so you can actually look and see what the actual configuration is. And there is a little schematic in the paper that shows the
I wasn't sure if that was realistic though, or if that was just a schematic.
It is realistic based on the picture. Yeah, you can sort of confirm that's what it is.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Yes, in answer to your question, the only thing I would say is that the corridor proposed for the broadleaf woodland sections of the development is narrower than the it's get this right. It's 30 meters. It's not as wide as the coniferous plantation wayleave would be, which again would increase collision risk, we think, for the broadleaf section.
Yeah, that's 70 metres for the broadleaf, 90 for the coniferous. But I think we were having a discussion yesterday around how that wayleave could be managed, and if it would benefit Capcalia, or there was a feeling it could help to reduce the impacts. There might be options to look at having maintaining that same 90-metre wayleave in broadleaf woodland, in broadleaf woodland as well.
But again, either way, any effect, I think you accept that, any effect from the corridor being narrower in Norway could only have worsened the situation, and in any event, the applicant didn't reduce their estimates based upon it. You accept that? Thank you. And again, a similar point, final point was possible observation on the prevalence of hunting in Norway, which surprised me that they hunt these things, but there you go. I think the applicant's view is that might possibly make it more likely that Capcalia would take flight in response to disturbance, and again, that could put them at a greater risk. But again, the applicant didn't make any assumptions in the calculations to that effect. But it's a factor that you think might exaggerate the effect in Norway?
It could do in theory. I've no idea how likely it is that people would be hunting close to the towers, such that disturbed birds would be at risk of flying into them. I've no idea, but yes, in theory, it would increase the likelihood of birds flying and could increase the likelihood of collisions.
Yeah, it was really something that came out of a conversation with Roy Dennis about how birds react and his experience of that, and that that might have there's nothing definite, but that might have an influence on the behaviour. Birds in Scotland are not used to being hunted. If they are disturbed, they may hunker down. That's the typical response. Whereas in Norway, the response that means you're more likely to survive is to flush and to escape as quick as you can. So that might mean that more birds collide, but that's where it came from.
Another issue which came up at an earlier stage, I think this is the Habitats Regulations appraisal that the applicant did, was the question of habituation and whether birds might, because there is a 275 kV line in the locality, birds might have become habituated to that. Really just a very short point that would only apply to birds that had a territory in the vicinity of that line, and any birds that were dispersing in, first-year females, for example, would have no idea of that, and you couldn't apply that habituation theory to those pairs. You accept that, yes?
Yes. Yep.
But again, you didn't assume any habituation in your numbers, no?
No.
So the next point I had was the subject of the update that we had last night on Site B, and I think, putting it very crudely, the applicant's point was, well, if Nature Scott's predictions of collision rates were accurate, we'd have expected to see RSPB's Capercaillie officer having found carcasses within Site B, and I think you actually asked her, if you just explain the situation maybe more clearly.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we hadn't really considered this until that particular point was made in the hearing statement, and it just made me think how likely this was. Have we missed something? And the Capercaillie officers said that the monitoring that they do around, let me get this right, Site B, doesn't include the area where the existing line is, and they wouldn't find anything. Plus, they're not there very frequently, really. And we know, for example, from the Bevenger paper, I think it is, of the Norway studies, they did some trials to see how quickly carcasses are removed by scavengers, and found that, I mean, they didn't give very much detail, unfortunately, but in essence, that carcasses are likely to be found within no more than a few days in the spring period. I think this was specifically. I don't think they did anything more extensively, but so unless you're there, looking really frequently for these carcasses, the chances of finding them is slim. And remember that they used sniffer dogs basically to find carcasses in those studies to increase detection rates. So yes, they haven't found any carcasses in the area, but then they wouldn't, because they're not looking in the right areas, and they're not looking per se. And that's where Capercaillie officer then offered the fact that they'd found carcasses elsewhere just during routine. Well, they had found one, I think it was, and they'd had reports of 3 others from people just noticing them, and one person who witnessed an actual event. So that's how that just developed. Yep.
Now that was interesting, and although it seemed they were quite rare finds, your point is that they would be rare because the birds aren't going to hang around there. Somebody's going to take them, eat them. That seems quite likely.
Yeah, and just specifically the Bevenger paper, when they did that scavenger trial, they from that they assumed that they were missing 70 to 80% of carcasses, even though they've got dogs on the ground, and I can't remember how frequently they were looking. It was weekly or fortnightly or something like that, I think it was. So.
Let's come back on that at all.
Just not specifically in relation to the RSP looking at or identifying the birds under that section of the line, but really a couple of points that we noticed from looking at that data last night, if now's a good time to cover that. So where the type of power line is reported, they're all distribution lines, which, you know, if anything, kind of backs up our understanding that it's likely to be those lower lying distribution lines that cause more of a threat to Kapkeli collision. The record from Marangi, where the tug power line is unknown, there is a distribution line that runs through that SPA. There aren't any transmission lines that are within that SPA. There are ones that are to the south of it, but so that would also suggest that that's a distribution line. And although RSP have said that they don't survey under the section of the line that we're interested in for this project, it's interesting that they do get reports of Kapkeli collisions under overhead lines, you know, from the wider public, and that if the level of collision that was being predicted from the NatureScot estimates was happening in a line, on a section line, you know, the fact that birds are being reported, it would make you think if there was that number of collisions every year, it's, you know, a member of the public may well have found that and reported that as well.
Thank you. There was one final point. The applicant refers to document 51D, that we need to get it open, which shows two existing overhead lines, 132 kV and 275 kV, running between two other SPAs. And I think the point was that there's been no suggestion that they posed a risk to Kapkeli populations within those SPAs, and that the population of one of them has actually increased in recent years. Do you have any thoughts on that, Dr. Parrish?
The SPA population that has increased in recent years, yeah, that's further away from the line, and the habitat on the other side of the line is mountain, so we wouldn't expect Kapkeli to be moving across there anyway. As far as I can gather, we have raised the issue of collision risk with works that have happened on these lines. Both these lines, I should say, were in place at designation. So there's not something that we've had to consider in terms of an application coming in, you know, subsequently. But there have been works done on them to varying degrees. Nothing, if I'm remembering correctly, that's added materially to the structure itself. But, you know, and we have discussed collision risks and that kind of thing. But there's been no material change to the structures. So we haven't sort of had to comment formally from an HRA perspective. And again, as I mentioned before, I think overhead lines just haven't really been on our radar in terms of site condition monitoring. So we haven't raised any issues with them because we haven't looked, to be perfectly honest. So we don't know what the situation is, to be frank.
The only point was just on the location of those other transmission lines in relation to the SPAs, because they do run between two SPAs. So it's not just that there are mountains, there's no other suitable habitat on the other side. The line bisects the two SPAs, and you might expect some movement of Kapkeli between those two SPAs across those transmission lines. And there doesn't appear to be any effect of those lines on certainly the SPA to the north.
Okay, so I'd like to look at the three mitigation measures and the likely effectiveness of them. So proximity to the existing overhead line, corridor planting, and tower marking. So in terms of the first one, the proximity, Dr. Parrish mentioned the pallet study earlier, which I think the quote I had from that, this was the Namibia and South Africa study. Power line surveys in Namibia and South Africa indicate 87% of the bird collisions occurred in and near the middle of sections of the span. Only 13% of collisions occurred near the towers themselves. This was the one study where they appeared to have actually made that distinction. And as I understand it, the concern with Bustard, which were the birds in question, I believe, is with them hitting the lines rather than the towers. They seem to have a particular problem with that. Mr. Wright, you're assuming that based upon the findings of the South African study, where offsetting the tower location has led to a 2/3 reduction in collisions. It's given, yes, we don't know precisely what Capercaillie collision involves, the balance between towers and conductors. It seems to me that the benefits to Bustard may actually be greater from that approach than we would expect from Capercaillie, given it appears the Bustards are hitting predominantly or significantly hitting the conductors rather than the towers based on that evidence. Is that correct?
I would say that the situation is much more similar between Bustards and Capercaillie. I think as we said, if you look at the literature on why overhead lines and which parts of overhead lines, as a whole structure, the towers and the conductors pose to birds, all the focus is on the conductors, and particularly on the earth wires, which are thinner and much harder to see. So it's the structures that the birds don't see that they collide with. So that study shows that the Bustards are able to see and avoid the towers, and they collide with the lines. I think it's more likely than not that it's the same with Capercaillie, and that the studies that show or look at impacts with overhead lines and Capercaillie from Norway, they don't make a distinction between the towers and the lines. Dr. First is right, but I think if there were collisions with the towers, they would mention that. They're looking at where the collision victims are in relation to the infrastructure. I just think that it would be unusual if there was an impact with a tower, and they would report that in the literature.
With regards to the pallet study, again, I would remind you that in the discussion they say that the data suggests that Bustards avoid the towers most of the time, so that it's not been excluded. But this 67% reduction in collisions if the towers are staggered was theoretical. It wasn't proven. They didn't do it. It was a theoretical outcome. If they did a mathematical exercise basically, and they tested it on a very short 11-kilometre section of lines where there happened to be parallel lines that were out of sync. And there did seem to be an effect, but it was, no collisions versus one collision on an even shorter section of single line somewhere. So it's not proven, and I would also say that it was, different habitat. It was scrubland, I think they describe it as, where very little vegetation, low vegetation, and I don't know how the span widths compare, for example, between towers. They describe it in the paper. I have no idea what the span widths would be in the proposed development and the existing line, and also how the lines would sit together and whether there's habitat in between the lines. From my point of view, looking at a map, it looks as if there's going to be some big gaps between the lines and some narrower gaps. So, and it's not clear whether the applicant is actually proposing to shift towers to optimise that sort of offsetting effect. But even so, as we've maintained throughout, we have a concern about collisions with towers. So this could be making it worse. We don't know. And yes, there's no firm evidence out there to show that birds are colliding with, or Capercaillie are colliding with the towers. But they collide with turbine bases, they collide with trees occasionally, they collide with various things, depending on the circumstance. So again, we can't exclude it, and we would be concerned that this could make it worse, not better. It's a difficult one though, because I do concede that they might be hitting cables as well, so it might help from that point of view, but it might make things worse by higher collisions with towers.
2 points there really. If I don't know if you know the answer to this, but I don't know if any work's been done with the sort of engineers to work out how feasible it is to actually alter the span widths to offset them. And secondly, if it were concluded that in fact tower collision is a problem, then do you accept Dr. Parrish's point of view that actually presenting more towers as a barrier could actually make things worse?
If there was if there is an impact there, then it could conceivably you're putting another structure in the environment. But we have taken account of those concerns and proposed mitigation to make the towers more visible, so that if there's an issue there, you know, we would be mitigating that. I was just trying to remember the first part of the question. Sorry.
Whether you know whether the engineers would be happy for you to start moving their towers along the line, different spacing to achieve that kind of offsetting.
I'm not sure that's been looked at, but I could maybe ask a colleague to answer that. But certainly when we looked at the existing towers and where the towers are proposed to go, there is a degree of offset already in the locations we looked at. So.
Not necessarily proposing anything different. You think there's already sufficient offsetting to have some benefit?
Yeah, and I think obviously the degree of offset will depend on where a bird is coming from, you know, the angle that they're looking at, how they perceive the towers. But I still think the argument that where there are more structures and a more visual cue, that there is an obstacle to avoid, it's more likely that the birds will therefore avoid that obstacle.
Did you want to say anything, Mr. Brown? Just no, you can do it.
Just on that, it is a very precise mitigation that has been applied to the figures here, 67%. And if we're not sure exactly the degree of, you know, offsetting, etc., it seems I'm not sure how that precise figure has been arrived at. The theoretical reduction in collision risk in the African study, like I said, was based on a perfect staggering of the towers in a mathematical exercise. So if we're not sure that all the towers are going to be offset, etc., then I don't know how we've got to such a precise figure, exactly the same as the African study.
And quite a high figure, if that's fair. You know, you're putting quite a lot of weight on the benefits of this.
Yeah, it is quite a large reduction, but you know, the evidence behind that in that study, I think, is quite compelling. That you get more collisions in the centre of the spans. I agree that it's not exactly the same situation. The habitats are different, the species are different, but yeah, we thought it was reasonable to apply that on the basis that the birds would perceive more of the towers, see it as more of an obstacle, and would take more avoiding action.
Just one final point I would make is, again, emphasising the difference in the habitats in the areas. In Africa, the birds are approaching these things with a much better view. You know, we're not talking about a situation where the towers or the lines are obscured by woodland, for example. And we know from extrapolating from the black grouse vision study that was done that we reckon that capercaillie need at least 38 metres to detect and avoid something under ideal conditions. So, you know, it's a very what is proposed in the development is a different scenario where a lot of the time we're talking about a narrow corridor that the birds are going to be emerging from. So again, you know, adding obstacles. Yes, in theory, perhaps a tower has got more to it that can be seen, but that assumes that the bird's got the time and the conditions are such that they can see it. You know.
I'd like to move on to corridor planting, if I can. So the applicant proposes corridor planting with heathland species to manage the ground layer, habitat and vegetation in order to encourage birds to walk across the wayleaf rather than fly across it. In addition to heather and blaeberry, the applicant's confirmed its agreement to Nature Scott's suggestion of planting other small shrubs for cover, etc. I just want to clarify my understanding of what length of the corridor would be planted in this way, if that's yet been determined. Would it be the 7.1 kilometres? Would it be expanded, or would it just be some proportion, or is it still yet to be determined the extent of that?
The intention for that mitigation was to apply it to the section of the span where we considered there to be a risk of collision. So we'd initially proposed for that to be that 7.1 kilometres. If we were to take the view that it's that full 11.2 kilometres, which is all within woodland or within short sections of open areas within woodland, then it would be applied to that whole area.
And the shadow appropriate assessment says the establishment of heathland vegetation in these areas, that is areas where heather and blaeberry don't already exist, may be dependent on factors such as soil condition, light conditions, etc. Fair enough. So consideration will be necessary to understand full feasibility. Where heathland conditions cannot be achieved, a rough tussock grassland habitat is considered to be appropriate. How can a rough tussock grassland prove to be effective in encouraging walking if it's not providing the sort of things that capercaillie want to eat? Or is that why you're not putting any additional percentage reduction on this measure, as it's somewhat speculative?
That's a good question, and I think in the hearing statement we updated that because we had some of the feedback from NatureScot, and when we're on site talking to Roy Dennis about what might encourage the birds to walk rather than to fly, and the view is that actually having more kind of scrub vegetation, small trees that would still be within the health and safety clearance for the line would be more appropriate and would be more likely to encourage birds to walk rather than fly. So I think we've updated that in the hearing statement just to acknowledge that yes, that's a helpful recommendation from NatureScot and that we would take that on board.
This was putting in things like juniper, I think, was it, and things to provide cover. But I'm just wondering if the habitat proved absolutely impossible for things like heather and blaeberry to grow, then you're kind of stuck. You can't change. Do we yet know what proportion of that line section would never, in fact, support food species, shall we say, important food species? You might be able to get, say, juniper to grow, but you might never be able to get something like heather or blaeberry to grow. Do you accept that?
Yeah, we haven't. I think that's why the mitigation proposal is contingent on doing studies to see how much of that would be suitable. So we don't know that proportion, but I guess the mitigation we were proposing had two core benefits. One, to address the loss of habitat, and then one to encourage the birds to fly. Not to fly. So providing blaeberry is helpful in terms of providing foraging habitat that would help to support the population. In terms of mitigating for potential collision risk, I think any large woody cover that is going to make the birds feel safer and that they're happy to walk across would be effective. So although we can't say the percentage or how much of that we could successfully plant with blaeberry, that would be subject to further studies. From looking at the site, a lot of the edges of site B, for example, there is, it's kind of willow scrub in there already. So I think there's a high likelihood that could be established.
Yeah, we broadly agree. Heather and blaeberry would be ideal because it provides the cover. It also provides food, as you said, and it's a habitat that they're familiar with, and we hope it would keep them on the ground. But as the applicant says, I think if that's not possible, then something that's going to provide a bit of canopy cover doesn't have to provide food, but you want something that the birds are going to feel secure walking through. And that's an important point as well. This has to be managed going forwards because it has to be maintained, in a condition that the birds will use. A lot of this stuff will change over time, and it's important that the functionality is maintained. And another point I would make as well is that presumably, depending on, for all scenarios, there will be a delay in the establishment of this ground cover. So there's going to be a gap, a varying gap, in when this stuff is going to be present, which I think is an important consideration.
Just on the maintenance point, I've read somewhere, I think it's document 48B, Forester, about the need to prevent ground vegetation becoming so tall and rank that chicks can't walk through it. So there will need to be some additional maintenance work carried out in the corridor over and above what you would otherwise have had to do. I'm assuming that provided that that was conducted outside the breeding period, there would be no concern over that creating its own disturbance problems.
Not from my perspective. I think that could be managed, and the applicant's Capercaillie species management plan would cover for that eventuality. That plan would cover construction and operation.
You're content with that, yeah?
Yes, sorry, yes, no problem at all. Yeah. As long as that habitat is maintained and that functionality is maintained, that's the important point.
I have to ask a point about concern raised by RSPB Scotland about potential for deer grazing undermining the proposed planting. I just wonder how one could avoid, without putting deer fences in obviously, how one could discourage or minimise the effect of deer grazing if that is considered to be a problem.
Yeah, I think that that's something that you have to contend with in a lot of habitat management plans, and the detail of that would come out in the full plan. But certainly, you know, overplanting of the original setup of the habitat could help with that. And one of the things that we've discussed with estates looking at Capercaillie mitigation and compensation is support for deer management as well. So that might be something that could be looked at as well to help with that.
Yep, and I would agree, and I think, you know, a degree of grazing could be beneficial. It could help to maintain the structure that we're looking for. So, you know, deer aren't necessarily going to be bad, full stop, but the situation would need to be managed, as we've said. But the details, yeah, we don't know.
Fine, that's very helpful. So, turning to tower marking, I think I'm right in saying, Dr. Parish, your email giving feedback to the applicant in February of this year, which is NSCOT-2, I don't think you need to look at it, but you seem to be quite in favour, in principle, of, I think you say, high contrast painting would be worth doing to hopefully make the towers more visible to Capercaillie in flight. You accept that while untested, it was likely to reduce collision risk. But then subsequently you have raised the issue, and you mentioned it earlier this morning, about low light conditions or fog, and how effective, it's obviously better than doing nothing, but how effective in those conditions would it be? Obviously it's a very different approach to the orange netting that you get on deer fences. I just wonder if we know whether that orange netting is less effective also in low light or in fog or those sort of conditions. Has anyone ever studied that?
Not specifically that I'm aware of. I mean, in theory, yes, it would be less effective, certainly in foggy conditions, for example, because obviously it's obscured to a degree, you know. Yeah, we agree that marking the towers in some fashion should help to reduce collision risk. And the important point is to increase the degree of internal contrast, because as we touched on earlier on, you can't rely on contrast with the background to be constant, because birds are coming from different angles, conditions change. So, you know, one background might be great and make the tower stand out, but another background might make it effectively disappear to the bird's perspective. So that's why we've focused on the sort of potential banding markings on the lower parts of the tower to increase internal contrast. But it is an untested approach in towers. So again, we're not able to put a figure on the degree to which that would reduce collisions.
Yeah, and you haven't indeed made any kind of reduction in your alternative calculation. Don't incorporate any reduction for either that or the planting within the wayleave. But if you accepted that it could have some benefit, then presumably some reduction, we don't know what, but some reduction might be appropriate in terms of what you predict would be the collision risk.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's a good point to come on to our figures. Maybe there's an element of confusion here, for which I apologise, but we weren't suggesting that our figures were right and that the applicant's figures were wrong. We were trying to provide an alternative based on exactly the same data, but with different assumptions applied, come up with very different answers, just to show that it's not obvious what the correct answer should be, you know. But yes, I mean, I accept that theoretically marking the towers should make them more conspicuous in a wider range of circumstances, and should help the birds to see the towers. It is complicated slightly by this fact that, you know, we think that capercaillies in flight need about 38 metres to see these structures, marked or not, and then they need to be able to move around them. And if it's a 10-metre wide base that they've got to move around or avoid it, and you know, the bases are semi-permeable, so they can go around one strut and into the next one, or something. You know, it's a complicated situation. It's very hard to predict how birds will react to them. So again, that's why we haven't sort of tried to put a figure on this.
Yeah, we have applied that reduction, and I think in terms of the how visible the mitigation would be in different light conditions, different weather conditions, the study that we've drawn from and applying orange fencing to deer fences, you know, was a relatively long-running study, so it would have taken into account different weather conditions, different times of day. You know, so that's almost kind of factored in, if you like, to the findings of that study. The research on and the paper on black grouse shows that internal contrast and having contrasting shapes is likely to be the most effective way of increasing the visibility. So, although the orange fencing has been shown to work, the research would suggest that using black and white stripes could be even more effective than that, because that's what the birds are most likely to perceive, and give them the most contrast and give them the most opportunity to see and avoid the structures. So we think that's although it's taking a mitigation that's been applied in a different context and applying it to the towers, that feels appropriate. And I think it's a point we made in the hearing statement as well. There are other cases of mitigation measures being demonstrated for other species or in other contexts being applied to overhead lines, and that being acceptable. And so I think we're in a similar situation here.
Yes, if I may just on that. Yes, I mean, I do take the point that I still think that the marking of deer fences that's been done is still inherently different in that it's a very long, continuous structure that is marked versus what we're proposing with the tower, which is specific. I mean, I don't know how you describe them technically, but bits of metal on a strut. That, I mean, it's all broken up. There's 4 individual struts. There are supporting lines. You know, it's not a continuous sort of marking around that whole thing. And yes, we are content to generally accept that line markers will mitigate collision risk, usually to the order of about 50%, because that's based on a lot of study. That's been looked at, that's been done. We don't have equivalent figures that we can apply reliably to the towers here. And again, you know, we are obliged to take a precautionary approach, and if we can't prove something or disprove something, we have to be ultra cautious in this.
Yeah, I understand. Could we turn to habitat loss? Probably worth looking at the shadow appropriate assessment. Table 2.2, which is on PDF page 19. So the applicant has considered habitat loss and has identified primary capercaillie woodlands as native pine woodlands, other Scots pine woodlands, and bog woodland, including areas of blanket bog within or close to woodlands. All other woodlands are considered to be secondary habitat. And there's a minor, I think, arithmetical error in the table, which RSPB pointed out. I had actually already spotted it, honestly. If you add those habitats together, I think you get 34.54 hectares and not 35 points. So the applicant's actually doing themselves out of a hectare of habitat. I don't think that has any significance. You've adopted that 35.5 for all subsequent measures that you're proposing. It's actually an over provision in that sense. The more interesting point was RSPB Scotland's statement in its response to the shadow appropriate assessment that capercaillie have been found during the breeding season in a variety of woodland types, and that forest structure is more important than tree species or age. It notes the SPA citation for Darnaway and Leatham Forest SPA includes larch, spruce, Douglas fir, and to a lesser extent oak and birch. As such, it thinks that W2C, other coniferous woodland, which it says includes active lek sites, should be added to the primary habitat total, which would have a significant increase in that total. I think it would take primary habitat loss from 34.5 up to about 82.6 hectares. I'll ask Nature Scott first, what do you think? Is RSPB taking too strong an approach there?
I think it's fair to say that we haven't had too many problems with the issue of habitat loss here, and we haven't dwelt on that. I think this sort of reliance on primary versus secondary classification of habitats is debatable, and I think RSPB have a point, and secondary habitats can be, maybe they don't provide everything that capercaillie need, but they can provide very crucial resources in particular times of year or under certain circumstances or something like that. You know, it isn't always clear cut. However, as I said, we haven't taken a strong stance on this because we don't think that the degree of habitat loss is sufficient to object to the proposal.
Yeah, I would agree that the capercaillie do use different types of habitat, different types of year for different purposes, and that other habitats can provide important habitat for capercaillie. However, in the wider area, there's a huge amount of available suitable habitat for capercaillie, which isn't occupied for reasons of other pressures on the population declining. So we've looked at the habitat that is most likely to be suitable and most likely to be used by capercaillie and provided mitigated for that, because that's most likely to present all of the requirements that capercaillie have. The other thing that's worth looking at as well, we took a relatively precautionary approach there when we looked at habitat loss, and we looked at all of the loss within 11 kilometres from the SPA. That includes a lot of woodlands that are not occupied by capercaillie, haven't been occupied by capercaillie for a long time, but the provision of mitigation would be summed up and most likely provided in one or a small number of areas, and would provide more value to capercaillie than the habitat that would be lost. So.
Turning to the proposals for Scots pine woodland planting, I just wanted to check that the 35.5 hectares that's referred to in the shadow appropriate assessment, that's on top of whatever heathland habitat creation you do within the corridor. This is something else. We're not deducting the 7.1 kilometre length or whatever the length might be. We're not deducting the area of that from the Scots pine woodland because it's something else. It's 35 on top of whatever you do within the corridor.
Yeah, it would be on top of, and I think within the shadow appropriate assessment, we'd already said this, but we set out again in the hearing statement that we'd be looking at creating or managing the woodland, because I think there's a valid point made by Nature Scott that there is a lag in that habitat being created and then becoming suitable for capercaillie, where there's a lot of habitat that already exists that's not in great condition that could be managed much more quickly to provide the same benefit. So that would probably be the preference.
I think, Dr. Parrish, your point was we'd like to have the 1-to-1 plus we'd like to have some, is that a very crude way of saying we'd like to have some existing woodland enhanced and we'd like to have 35.5 created?
No. As was just reported there, we were concerned that reliance on creating 35 hectares of Scots pine woodland would mean a very significant lag before it was of use to Capercaillie. So I think the same effect could be achieved, as was said, if you take a bit of unenhanced woodland where there's scope to be improved, as long as it's in the right areas, you know, it's going to be of use to the Capercaillie. It's have to be very carefully targeted, but that would be a much quicker way of getting some benefit back to the birds.
Sorry, I'd misunderstood you. So, and you're content that the details of all of that, what balance would be new creation, what balance would be enhancement, or perhaps all of it could be enhancement. You're content that could be left to a condition that you could be involved in discharging.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, turning now to disturbance. I actually don't have much to ask about disturbance because I think it's helpfully Nature Scott's confirmed it's actually less concerned about, I think, disturbance than, you've reiterated that today. RSPB Scotland does, however, have some concerns. The quote I have is, whilst the proposed mitigation of avoiding the breeding season during construction may help to protect breeding Capercaillie during this time, it would be insufficient to protect the resident population year-round, which is undoubtedly connected to the SPA under 5 kilometres away. My note is really you're content that outside the breeding season your disturbance effect wouldn't be significant, or it's not sufficient for you to have concern.
No, we're happy with the proposals so far of how works would be undertaken and how Capercaillie would be dealt with outside of the breeding season. And I think there are still discussions ongoing about the details of that and that sort of thing. So, yeah, we don't have a problem with disturbance issues.
I find that's helpful. There was just a query from RSPB Scotland on the Capercaillie Species Protection Plan. They raised a question as to whether reference to the term known Capercaillie woodlands could be defined more tightly, and I think the applicant is willing to tie that to the core Capercaillie area map. I think that's right, and I don't think, again, Nature Scott has any concerns with that. The plan itself would obviously evolve in consultation with the likes of you and RSPB Scotland. Are you content with that?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, I think the map would form the basis of that, where that mitigation would be targeted, I think, and then I think it would make sense, given the current status of the population, that, you know, check surveys would be undertaken to see if there are likely to be any Capercaillie there before any other measures were implemented, because a lot of that core area simply doesn't support Capercaillie anymore.
Thank you. Okay, turning item 5, invasive non-native species, tree diseases. Again, Nature Scott's helpfully confirmed it's actually quite relaxed, quite satisfied with the applicant's proposals in this regard. So I didn't have any questions. I assume that's correct. Yes, you're happy with that. Good, thank you. That's helpful. Item 6, cumulative effects. Again, I think Nature Scott content that applicants adequately dealt with that. I had one quick question about the Dulcie Wood wind farm, which I think has just got through the scoping stage. It's really a question for Nature Scott. Given how early in the consenting process that is, you contend that this proposal doesn't need to consider the potential for cumulative effects. So that the opposite will be true. If and when it gets to a consenting stage, it will need to take effect of whatever the outcome of this inquiry is, rather than this inquiry having to take account of that because it's so early in this process.
I assume so, but I defer to my colleague.
Yes, that would be our approach. Yeah.
Helpful, thank you. Okay, item 7 was on securing off-site mitigation and compensation. Obviously, whatever measures are agreed or thought to be necessary should ministers decide to grant consent need to be capable of being secured. And I understand Nature Scott's had some feedback from Energy Consents, which does ring a bell with me as well, about the Scottish Minister's ability to secure mitigation and compensation measures off-site in the context of an Electricity Act application. And secondly, the appropriateness of using a Grampian condition on land that isn't within the applicant's control, and whether in fact a planning obligation might be required. So it's really just to get the parties' views. Might be a matter for the parties' lawyers, I don't know, but what mechanism, assuming that that's the way ministers want to go, what mechanism would be appropriate to, assuming that it is possible to secure off-site works, which, as I say, you might be able to tell us about this. The feedback from Energy Consent was casting some doubt on that. So maybe I'll ask you about that first. What this issue you've heard about is, and then what we think might be, in fact, the situation in terms of being able to secure things off-site.
Thanks. Yes, sorry. And it's something we're trying to get further information from them on at the moment. You know, because it was raised as an issue and a while back now, and we've been you know, contacting them to try and get clarification on just exactly what the issue is, and you know, how that would affect you know, the approach we take in each case where we're looking to secure measures. So we're not. I'm afraid I've had no reports today of anything new. So
if I could just answer, I understand that this is an issue which is common to a number of different ongoing matters in parallel. So the response will probably relate to all of them. And in the context of another matter, we've been told that the ECU will provide a response in September.
Yeah.
If I could clarify on the Section 75 front as well, ideally a Section 75 would be used in addition to a Grampian type condition to secure off-site mitigation or off-site works. However, we realise that that's not always logistically feasible. We realise it's not practical and it might harm kind of general viability. But if the applicant were open, for example, to considering a Section 75 in critical areas once those are identified through the mitigation, pre-mitigation studies, that would be very helpful, and NatureScot would be happy to collaborate with them on that.
Sir, I'll make the general observation that will be apparent from a line of questioning earlier this week, that we're anxious about conditions that are out with our control and could require a process that would be inconsistent with the timescale that's been set at a UK and thus reserved level for the delivery of this. So I'll make that general observation. You'll have seen we've rearranged slightly who's at the table. Mr. Hamilton is now next to me, and he may be able to give you a slightly fuller answer or comment on that.
Thank you, sir. My name is Colin Hamilton. I'm a partner at Gillespie McAndrew Solicitors. Yes, in my view, as a matter of law, there's no requirement for an applicant to control land, provided the condition is a negative or suspensive one. And that's apparent not just from law, but also from the circular you'll be familiar with at paragraphs 37 and 38. I think in the NatureScot hearing statement, they'd perhaps referred to paragraph 36, or taken the words from paragraph 36 without going on to consider paragraphs 37 and 38, where they refer to the need to have control of the land for off-site works. That's true if it's a positive condition, but not a negative condition. And then the other point to make is that, of course, Grampian conditions can be suspensive not just of the whole of the development, but of part of the development. So in this case, the part or possibly affected would be either the 7-kilometre or 11-kilometre stretch, and a condition could be attached to that part only. The other point I think to make is that this is a Section 37 application rather than just a planning application, and so ministers have a choice of whether to attach conditions to the planning element or to the Section 37 element. And of course, in the Section 37 element, that will give ministers the direct control over those conditions. So that may be a matter ministers want to take into account in deciding the effectiveness of conditions as a use. In my view, the use of a Section 75 agreement would overcomplicate matters for the reasons Mr. Reid has referred to.
Okay, thank you. And we're talking conditions next week. Yeah, it'd be useful if we do get a response from energy consents to see what that is and what precisely the problem is, and maybe the timing will work out okay in terms of closing submissions. Maybe it won't. But, I mean, ultimately, our report will go before them on its way to ministers. So technically, they will present our report to ministers. So if they disagree with us on the point, then ministers will presumably get the benefit of their advice rather than ours, or at least our advice will be interpreted in the light of their spin on it. So it'd be nice to know sooner rather than later if there is a fundamental problem in their view, and then we can hear your submissions and we can put that argument to them as well. But I think we'll just have to leave that there for now, but that's helpful to understand the background. We're making good progress. This section, which is section 8, shadow derogation case and compensation plan, might take slightly longer, but hopefully not too bad. So I think first point, it's a simple one because NatureScot has confirmed that just in terms of the environmental consequences of undergrounding the whole section, you're not taking issue with the applicant's conclusion that, in fact, that wouldn't have a preferable implications, certainly for Capercaillie, than what is currently proposed.
Yeah, that's correct. There are pluses and minuses, but overall we think it would not improve the situation.
Thank you, that's very fair. So I'd like to look at the compensatory measures that are set out in, I think it's Annex C to the shadow derogation case, which is a separate PDF. I'll just get that open. So this is the compensation plan. Or I guess at this stage, it's presumably it's a proposed compensation plan. There could be further negotiation as to finalising it. All we need, I think, at this stage is to be able to advise ministers if they are going down that road. So if they concluded that the proposal would harm the integrity of the SPA, but nevertheless wanted to grant consent on the basis of EROPI, that they can be content that the regulations requirements are met. So I don't want us to just set it aside and assume it can all be resolved by a condition. I just wanted to talk about what it contains, what it should contain, and I think NatureScot's expressed some concern about the overall approach, which I think is involving certain alternative measures rather than a comprehensive suite of something that might compensate more satisfactorily if all delivered as a whole package. So I want to talk about that, and then I want to talk about each of the individual proposals, just to look at things like the ratio at which it is to be provided, whether that sounds to be in the right kind of ballpark, and also the basis on which the figures are calculated, setting aside the disagreement over the likely collision risk and the likely mortality rates and all of that. We'll have to park that for a second, but just to work out the basis for how things have been calculated and etc. So just looking at the overall approach, I'm mindful that document 47P, I don't think we need to open it. That's the European Commission publication 2018 titled Managing Natura 2000 Sites. Provisions of Article 6 of the Habitats Directive. It sets out criteria for designing compensatory measures. One of these deals with the extent of compensation. And the quote that I have from that is, the extent required for compensatory measures to be effective is directly related to the quantitative and qualitative aspects inherent to the elements of integrity likely to be impaired and to the estimated effectiveness of the measures. It expects compensation ratios, to be informed by the appropriate assessment, and that they should be well above 1:1. And appreciate, as we've discussed, there's clear difference between you on collision mortality rates, or the reliability of the applicant's estimates of collision mortality rates at least. Ministers need to reach their own conclusions on that, clearly. I just want to focus really on the broader questions of whether it's appropriate to base the quantum of compensation on these compensation ratios that are applied to whatever the collision mortality rate is, or whether some other indicator should be used to decide what quantum of compensation is provided, and also whether proposing a series of alternative compensation measures rather than a package of measures is the best way to do it. So I suppose the first simple question is, I think it's right to say, Dr. Parrish, that all of the measures, the ratios used for the various measures are in excess of 1:1, which is the sort of bottom line that, yeah, you can temper that. We'll look at the ratios in a minute, but I think, do you accept, Dr. Parrish, that the applicant's approach has been to assess or apply different compensation ratios depending on how quickly the benefits could be delivered and how well established the efficacy of those would be, so that those that are likely to be a good quick win and guaranteed to, or very likely to provide a good benefit, a lower ratio is being applied, whereas those that are longer term, such as planting forests and things, a much higher ratio has been applied. We'll come on to the figures in a minute, but do you agree with that basic approach?
I wasn't sure that that was the approach, but that sounds...
Please tell me if it's not.
that sounds feasible to me. I mean, we have various issues with this that we'll come on to, I'm sure, but that sounds reasonable.
Misunderstanding what your approach is.
No, that's right. The plan, as we have it, presents a suite of measures, and that's to allow us the flexibility of finding an approach that will work and will deliver the compensation within the very targeted area that we need to look at and the opportunities that are available there. And the ratios that we've proposed, as you say, are related to how long they might take to be implemented, how effective they will be, how proven that they are in their effectiveness. So yeah, where we have measures which can be implemented very quickly and we know they work very well, we've got a 1:2 ratio. And for the things like habitat creation, which will take longer and there's less certainty about whether the birds will use it or what final condition that would get to, we've got a 1:10 ratio. So.
In terms of how that suite is proposed, I think I'm right in saying that they would or could be delivered entirely as alternatives. So it might be that you only select, for whatever reason, one of those, one item out of that suite. I think Nature Scott's point was it would be better to develop a combined suite of measures rather than just picking one, because maybe perhaps it's easiest to deliver. Is that a fair criticism?
Potentially, but I think it also has to be grounded in the reality of what's achievable on the ground. So there's some of these areas, or some of the proposals, for example, robocutting may not be suitable in some areas of the woodland that would be available. The terrain may not be suitable, or landowners may not be happy to agree to woodland grazing, for example. So having a suite of measures, all of which we think could compensate in their own right, gives us that flexibility. And from an ecological point of view, probably a range would give the best outcome. But equally, we think each of these individually, in terms of woodland management, in terms of predator control or diversionary feeding, or fence line marking or removal, each of those as a sort of groupings could deliver the compensation if required.
I don't know if this relates back to Mr. Reed's point about time is of the essence, and in the event that you get consent, you want to be able to get cracking with your conditions. Is the concern perhaps that if you were required to negotiate some sort of combination of various factors that there's a time delay in having that agreed, or is it that purely that you're just content that any one of those factors would do the job?
I think we're content that any one of those could do the job, or a grouping of those could do the job. Discussions are ongoing with landowners, which would refine this down, and I think even from the point at which this was submitted, just negotiations have moved on, and we could refine this down further. So the timescales, I think, are less of an issue than providing that flexibility.
Mr. Parrish, I'm assuming I'm quoting you correctly that you would prefer to see a comprehensive package of various different measures delivered.
Yes, we don't disagree with any of the individual measures, and you know that we're talking about doing the right things. We have concerns about the amount of each individual measure, which, as you said, comes back to the risk of collision. But we are concerned that just trying to focus on, and I take the point that you know that there is a degree of flexibility here, and no decisions will be made about what's going to happen. That will look at what's possible and figure out where to deliver things. But we would think that that's still a bit risky. You know, putting all your eggs in one basket, forgive the pun, is potentially not going to have an effect if it's not quite in the right area, or if conditions change down the line. It's worth noting that the Nature Scots Scientific Advisory Committee, when they produced their report on Capercaillie, they produced a number of recommendations at the end of that for conservation action, and it was 3 or 4 key things, I think. But they made the point that delivering only one of these wouldn't do the job. It needs to be a package. It needs to be a suite of measures, and that's ultimately where we're coming from on this.
I was just going to make the point that in terms of what the goal of the compensation is, and I think the quote that you read out is quite helpful. We're looking really at compensating just for the impact of the project, so there are a lot of other issues that Capercaillie face. There's a lot of ongoing pressures, but you know, it's not necessarily the responsibility of the project to try and resolve those. We're looking at trying to compensate for the predicted impact of what we have. So.
Okay, well, turning to the individual measures, hopefully we can get through these reasonably quickly, but the first one I actually missed off my list, which was habitat creation. The applicant's proposal would be to create an area of habitat sufficient to support the theoretically lost number of individuals. I really wanted Nature Scots' thoughts on whether the creation of new habitat is an appropriate approach to compensating for collision mortality, and on the ratio that should be applied. So the applicant is suggesting a ratio of 1 to 10 should apply, given the time lag involved in actually creating habitat, which, based on the revised mortality figures, assuming that we were to accept the applicant's figures, that would equate to, assuming my maths is correct, between 29.4 and 46.2 hectares of new planting, depending on whether you assess the 7.1 or the full 11.2. What your thoughts on habitat creation is, either on its own or as part of the package? What do you think?
It could be good. It depends on the type of habitat that's created and how long we wait for it to develop. And as we said in the previous discussion, we would advise trying to manage existing woodland and improving, because there's lots of quick wins that could be done, and creating bog woodland, for example, and restructuring woodlands rather than starting from scratch and replanting. But yes, I mean, in theory, that would be a good thing. It could provide resources that provide nesting habitat or improve productivity within those nesting habitats that could offset collision losses, in theory.
Would you go so far as to say that even getting 46 hectares of new planting, because of the time lag, and bearing in mind the situation of Capercaillie in this locality being on the verge potentially of extinction, would you say that just delivering that in isolation, the full 46 hectares, if it were that high, wouldn't actually be beneficial because of the time lag? But by the time it's actually in a fit state to be useful, it might be too late. Am I overstating?
No, that's potentially true if we're talking about habitats that are going to take years to develop. Like I said, some quick wins could be done within a couple of years in terms of drain blocking to create boggy patches and that sort of thing. Would that be enough on its own? That's, again, we would be concerned. We would have worries that that's just a bit too risky, too much emphasis on the habitat side of things to improve productivity, because there are other things that could be limiting productivity that we don't know about, and that habitat could be great, but ultimately ineffective because other pressures are preventing it from doing its job.
Just a point there that if we reach a point where there are no Kappa anymore, the project wouldn't have an impact on them, and so would you be required compensation? But that's it's a very difficult area to project what's going to happen going forward.
Again, I would just make the point that we have to think about allowing that population to recover. So we have to think that birds are going to come back, and the SPA numbers will increase. We can't just say there's none left. We have to leave it there. We can't draw a line. If we get to that point, we have to act to try and re-establish that population.
Looking at diversionary feeding, the applicant's proposal in terms of the ratio or how you would calculate the quantum would be based upon 1 square kilometre per nesting female and a compensation ratio of 1 to 4, which could result in quite a significant amount of diversionary feeding. I'm just wondering whether it's realistic to expect that measure could be delivered on its own, whether the full quantum of compensation in this form would actually be appropriate, given that if you're over-providing food for predators more than perhaps you need, all you're doing is supporting the predators. Is that fair? Is there a danger that just, if you were to select just one option and you went with diversionary feeding, there is a danger that you could actually not really be doing any good?
Yes, and I think this, because of where we are with the project and with the negotiations with people, landowners and estates, we have to have that flexibility in there, and really we're trying to demonstrate that this is deliverable. The detail of how that would be implemented would have to be worked out in much more detail going forward. And I think there's a very valid point that just got made, that if you're doing diversionary feeding, it only works where you're targeting it where there are breeding females. So it would have to be very targeted, informed by annual surveys about where the birds are, and getting the amount of diversionary feeding right, so that you've got the intended outcome rather than anything else.
So it's probably fair to say that it's unlikely that this measure on its own would be sufficient. It would have to, if you were going to do some diversion feeding, it would be as a package with something else. Is that fair? Yeah,
absolutely. And I think we've proposed a management group, so that the final detail of what's going to work would be worked out with Nature with RSPB Scotland, with the relevant landowners. So we have a plan that will work and will deliver what we need to.
Just very specifically on your point about overfeeding the predators, so to speak, there is a very precise protocol for diversionary feeding developed by Aberdeen University and others, which I think is going to be the basis of this. And the evidence we have to date is that providing food for predators 6 to 8 weeks roughly during the breeding season does not have an impact on predator numbers. It's enough to distract them so they don't go looking for eggs and chicks, and it benefits the birds. We know that it increases productivity, but so far the evidence suggests that there is no rebound effect, so to speak, with more predators in the area or anything like that. So it can be very effective. The evidence to date suggests it can boost productivity, which there is perhaps evidence bleeding through now to suggest that that's increasing kappa numbers in some areas.
I think it's helpful. So the various other measures or alternative measures potentially that could be provided as compensation: restructuring woodland grazing, robo-cutting, bog creation, deer fence removal or marking. I didn't have any specific questions on those. There are different ratios to be applied, again, depending on how quickly they could be delivered and how confident one could be on their efficacy. I'm happy to hear any submissions as to any of those. Perhaps Nature's got any of those that you think wouldn't be appropriate. Are you generally content that some package involving all of those or most of those would be good?
No, we don't think any are inappropriate. Based on, again, the SAC, the Scientific Advisory Committee's report on kappa, any measures that are going to focus on improving kappa productivity, so creating the right habitat for rearing chicks, and as we've said, diversionary feeding, that sort of thing is likely to have a reasonably, once they're effective, it's likely to have a reasonably big impact. But to the point made that there have to be breeding birds there for those things to take effect. Creating the habitat could be beneficial in attracting birds in, and you know, dispersing birds might be more likely to settle, that sort of thing. But again, deer fence removal and deer fence marking could be very effective again at reducing collision mortalities for adults in particular, but adults and juveniles that are moving around. So all of them are useful, and I mean it depends where they got to go and that sort of thing. But I mean, as has been said, there's a process to go through to identify what's appropriate where and how they would be delivered. So we're content with that.
And next week we'll probably talk about a condition and how that could work, if it could work, and sort of timings and all of that. But that's probably as far as we can take that for now. I only had one more question actually, which was, I think the applicant's committing to a 30-year agreement to monitor progress and agreement with relevant landowners in terms of the ongoing delivery and success of the compensatory measures. Just really a question, do you think 30 years is sufficient?
We think it should be as long as the line is there. In essence, I mean, the line isn't going to disappear after 30 years, so if it's going to go in, carry on beyond that, and if there's still a risk of collision, then we think that the monitoring and the plan, the habitat plan or whatever it is, should continue alongside.
Just a point that the one of the other suggestions we have in here, or the commitments we have in here, is for the plan to be informed by monitoring, so that, you know, as we know, there's very little evidence out there on what the impacts actually are within Scotland on capercaillie, and so, you know, adaptive management, monitoring what the actual impacts are, will help us to, you know, first of all determine if there is an impact, and then if there is, and there is a compensation plan, you know, the compensation plan would be at the right level and targeted at what needs to be delivered. So. Okay, so that was all the questions I had. We've actually got through it by lunchtime, unless, and I'll turn to you each in turn, anything else you wanted to raise. Now's your chance. Side.
I don't think anything to raise. We have elicited evidence about undergrounding and some of the consequences of that earlier in the week, which it seemed to me overlapped the two issues. Mr. Brown is here if there are questions that have arisen out of the evidence I've led earlier in the week, who would be able to develop on that. But, sir, if you don't want to go there, you don't want to go there. It's a matter for you. But I'm conscious I trailed it in anticipation that there might be an overlap. But.
Within the scope of this, the capercaillie topic, I'm content to rely on Dr. Parish's agreement with Mr. Wright that undergrounding isn't necessarily better. So, as in terms of it being an alternative, you know, I'm content to take that expert advice.
Quite happy with that.
Thank you all very much. We got through that remarkably quickly. As there's nothing else, I'll close the session. Mr. Reid.
Maybe just two points to make whilst we're here. I'm conscious that it's been said there'll be a discussion about timetable for submissions next Thursday. It was also mentioned last night that you hope to have the report finished by the end of the calendar year. It may be helpful just to make the applicant's position clear on timetabling, given we'll be on Teams next week for the discussion. That position will be that the current timetable, that is submissions by those other than the applicant on the 10th of September, the applicant on the 24th of September, and the report submitted on the 3rd of December, should be adhered to. Short supplementary submissions can be provided in respect of agriculture within a timescale that respects the overall timetable. As I've said before, considerable resource has been committed, and numerous plans, both professional and personal, have been made in reliance on that timetable and in the good faith expectation that everyone else involved in this inquiry would work within and respect the timetable. This is also in the context of the priority guidance, the timetable set by the UK and thus at a reserved level, in respect of this critical national infrastructure, and the substantial cost implications associated with any further delay. The applicant would take any delay to that timetable very seriously, and accordingly, I should make clear that should the timetable be departed from, the applicant will request full written reasons for that, along with, in addition to, the reasons which have already been requested and which remain awaited for the agriculture decision. Having said all that, and wishing to finish on a lighter note, on behalf of the applicant, it is the work that has been done and the evident considerable work and preparation that has been done by both you, sir, and ma'am, in preparation for considering these applications is recognised and greatly appreciated, as is all that has been done to facilitate these sessions. And I wanted to say that whilst we're in person, I'll probably say something similar on Teams, but it doesn't necessarily convey quite the same. So I speak, I think, for the quite considerable cast that sit on this side in acknowledging what has been done to facilitate these hearings.
Thank you, Mr. Reid. On the subject of agriculture and the reasons for our decision to request further information on that, we will, we feel we've given a reason, but we appreciate that doesn't appear to be adequate, so we will be talking about that issue. You'll appreciate it's tied up with the need to ensure ministers have the fullest picture of the likelihood of any significant effects. We have submissions that say there will be some. We have reassurances that there won't. It's whether we have sufficient information to advise ministers that they can confidently say there won't be significant effects on agriculture. But we are conscious, very conscious of the need to prioritise this case. We've made commitments to that. So, you know, I think the aim is that we will perhaps give you a fuller explanation as to where we're coming from in the coming days. Thank you.
I just thought of fairness, making the position clear now, so that if there are reflections in advance of Thursday, that would be helpful.